of the general elections that will, inshallah, take place next Wednesday on the 7th of May. These general elections would choose a new National Assembly as well as new provincial legislatures. This general election will be the 5th since 1994. People may ask, and perhaps rightly so, of what use is my vote? How can I change a government that has lost credibility, some would say? How can I make a difference when it comes to corrupt politicians? What will my vote do with regards to the millions of rands that are squandered? So there are legitimate questions that we have to answer. So one is, should I vote or not? Two is, will my vote not be endorsing a system that is un-Islamic? Three, will my vote not be endorsing policies of a particular party that are against the law of Allah and the Quran? And four, who should I be voting for if I have to vote? Now, in the little time that we have before us, let us look at these four questions. The first question is, am I allowed as a Muslim to take part in a system that may be un-Islamic? When I talk of system, I'm talking of democracy. How Islamic is this entire notion of democracy? Now, we know that democracy has its pitfalls. No matter what it is made out to be, there are serious flaws in the system. One is that when we look at democracy, democracy emphasizes quantity over quality. And that's a pitfall of democracy. Quantity over quality. So if the vast majority of people vote into power those that are incompetent, you sacrifice the competent people over incompetent people purely by virtue of numbers. So democracy revolves and centers around the pillar of democracy is quantity. And that quantity oftentimes would compromise quality. And that's a pitfall of democracy. If you're looking at the system itself, democracy also tries to do the unnatural thing of creating equality amongst unequals. Democracy tries to create equality amongst unequals. What does it mean? that a person in a rural area who doesn't have the faintest idea of how to vote, who to vote, who's not competent enough to decide who should be ruling the country, has an equal vote with one who is educated, who perhaps is competent enough to decide, make an informed decision. But that's the harsh reality of the system. It is trying to create equality and give an equal vote to all, even though they may be unequal in terms of not in terms of the human vote, human dignity, but in terms of their competency. The pitfall of democracy is also manipulation. There are people who are vulnerable, whose votes could be bought, who could be influenced, coerced in different ways, and people are able to secure their votes. Democracy by nature is also the dictatorship of the majority. But that, no matter how flawed the system is, the question is, do we simply walk away and say the system is flawed and therefore we are not in a position to make our mark? These are the inherent flaws of the system. But by not voting, if a person chooses to abstain from making his mark, he is sending a message to those elected and to those in power, saying, I don't care what you do and how you do or what you don't do. And that is an extremely dangerous message to be sending out to people in power. That you can do, you are free to do as you wish and as you please. So by not voting, you are sending out a very, very dangerous message. By not voting, you're also saying there's nothing that you really want to change. By not voting, you are also saying that I will live in my cocoon, I would isolate myself, and hopefully what happens won't impact on me. And we know that we're not on an island on our own. Whatever happens at the polls is definitely going to impact on us. So the first question is that, are we happy with the system? No, we're not happy with the system, for the reasons that I've mentioned. But yet, we have no alternate but to go in and to make our mark. The second question that comes to the fore is that, will my vote, through my vote, am I endorsing what the party stands for, which may be un-Islamic? Am I endorsing the manifesto of a political party, which may be totally contrary to my teachings? And the answer to that, again, is no. By voting for a political party, you are not voting for all that the party stands for. It is not a carte blanche endorsement of the values that a party espouses. When you vote, it is not out of love for laws that are kufr or un-Islamic, but it is in the interest of the Muslim community. So voting doesn't mean that you're going to endorse all that the party stands for. It is not an endorsement, it is an empowerment. Your vote will empower the party that you choose to do what you think is in your interest. But taking part in the system doesn't end by casting your vote. There's more to democracy than voting and putting your cross against or making your mark on the ballot paper. It means getting involved. It means holding those people that you have empowered, holding them accountable. So, purely from an Islamic perspective, there are legal maxims that determine, that require us to be actively involved as citizens of the country. The first maxim, legal maxim, is that ma la yudrak, that which we cannot obtain totally, should not, la yutrak kullahu, that all of it should not be abandoned. That means if you cannot obtain the ideal, you should not walk away absolutely simply because you cannot obtain the ideal. So if we cannot obtain, under our current circumstances, the ideal of Islamic law, of Islamic governments, we're not permitted to walk away from the system itself. The second legal maxim is that without which you cannot fulfill your obligation becomes an obligation itself. That without which you cannot fulfill your obligations become an obligation itself. In other words, if we accept that our obligation is to protect our interests as a Muslim community, our obligation is to ensure that the rights of Muslims are guaranteed. Our obligation is to ensure that not only do we better the lives of the Muslim community, but all people residing in South Africa. If we accept that those are our obligations, and if those obligations cannot be secured except through the political process, then participation in the political process becomes an obligation itself. The third legal maxim is that we should proactively participate in undoing potential harm. In other words, if we do not participate, if we do not make our mark, through which the Muslim community will be marginalized, through which people would not be held accountable, through which we would not vote for a change, then we are undoing, or we are attracting harm on ourselves. So, in terms of whether voting endorses the system, yes, we know the system is rotten, but we have to strategically participate in the system to ensure that Muslim interests, Muslim rights in particular, and the rights of all citizens in general is procured through the vote or through the mark that we make. The question is who to vote for. That's a personal issue. But I can tell you who not to vote for, based on one aspect, and that is the foreign policy of different parties. If you look at the latest periodical from the South African Board of Jewish Deputies, they did their own homework in terms of guiding the Jewish community, and says what you should be looking at is the foreign policy of the various parties, with specific reference to Israel. And based on their own homework, they say that the African Christian Democratic Party, ACDP, gets 10 out of 10 for their support for Israel. The Inkatha Party gets 9 out of 10 for their foreign policy. The Democratic Party gets 7 out of 10, and the ANC gets 2 out of 10. And this is just looking at one aspect, the foreign policy of the various political parties. And that is enough to tell us where we should not be putting our vote. In the end, we must understand that when we cast our vote, it is part of our religious requirement to ensure that the party we choose may have a host of policies that are un-Islamic, but they are accountable, that you can bring them to the book. They have a history that is Muslim friendly, both locally and in terms of their foreign policy, and that Muslims or the identity of Muslims would not be compromised in particular. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant that the elections go off peacefully, that the result of the elections would not negatively impact on us as a community, and may give us the foresight and the wisdom to participate responsibly. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.